thanks everyone. Good afternoon. I have the unenviable task of being the last 30 minutes between you and your cocktail, so I'm going to try to keep this as punchy as I can. I titled this AI and the Future of Education, or What a Difference a Year Makes, because some of you may have, I don't even know if you were here when I talked at the same event a year ago, and so putting this presentation together was an occasion for me to think about everything that's happened in the past year, and it really has been quite dizzying. I think we're all suffering from a bit of vertigo from everything that we've experienced over this past year. But I want to kind of pull the lens back a little bit. We've had an incredible discussion today. I've certainly learned a lot about what is going on in so many different sectors and areas of activity, specifically related to how we're implementing AI in our marketplace. But I want to pull the lens back a little bit and talk about the bigger picture here, because we're seeing such fast evolution in the field of AI. I think we're going to, one argument is that we're going to see very dramatic changes in the business of education as well. So interestingly, the whole conversation about interoperability. These are the same conversations we were having 15 years ago when I was running power school and school and so there's been a very kind of slow incremental change in many of architectural aspects of the EdTech and education market. And one of the questions I'm really fundamentally interested with is, are we going to see something more like a dramatic step change? Or is this more hype and we're really going to continue to have these conversations for the next 10 years? So one of the things that I think about a lot, and in trying to understand where we've come over the course of the year. So a year ago, when I spoke to this audience, we were a year into the life cycle of ChatGPT. I spoke almost just under a year after the birth of the first public release of ChatGPT. So here we are a year later, and what are some of the ways we benchmark the growth and development and adoption of AI? By the way, I hate the term AI. I'm going to use it because we don't have better tools. Right now, I consider AI not to be a technical term as much as a description of a new approach to human-computer interface and computing. So this, some of you may have seen, this was a survey from CNBC this spring. We're now at the point where 50% of all the key stakeholders in education in the US, teachers, K-12 students, undergraduates, and parents, are using AI. Almost exactly or more than half of them are using it once a week or more. So a year ago when I spoke to you, I had just come back from a year of consulting for schools and universities around the world and asking the same question of everyone that I talked to. And at that time, this time last year, these numbers were about sub 20%. Just to give you a sense. Now, what's interesting is if you compare it to other industries, at that time, news journalists reported that 75% of news journalists around the world reported that they were using generative AI in their work. Today, that number is about the same. Very high, it hasn't changed that much. Coders, software developers, 90% reported using generative AI in their work, whether that was Copilot or was using ChatGPT to help debug, etc. We're still at about 90-95%. Interestingly, the end of this year, we think about 60% of all enterprise jobs will be written by AI providers. We expect that to be 100% in the next year. That is incredible change, right? Rate of change is incredible. But this is pretty remarkable. Just to give you a sense of why this 50% number is so interesting to me. So when the internet was born, it took a decade for half of our schools to be connected to it, let alone for anyone to use it. So we're talking about, we talk a lot about Moore's Law. We're talking about Moore's Law in the adoption of new technologies. And we're at a scale and a rate of change that we've really never seen before for almost any other kind of technology. So what I've been thinking a lot about, and this may seem very out of left field, a bit non-secular, but the question I keep asking myself is fire or microwave? So let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. Back in 2009, for any of you who haven't read it, this is a highly recommended book by a fellow named Richard Wrangham. A lot of the thinking behind which inspired folks like Michael Pollan and his book Cooked and his Netflix series. And Randall's whole argument is that humankind's ability to control fire was the first really clear example of how technology had a transformative effect on the shape and trajectory of human evolution. Because his argument was that our ability to control fire allowed us to do what? To cook. And cooking allowed us to break down very complex proteins, raw foods, into quickly digestible, highly caloric forms of intake. And that sole act you can trace to a step change in cognitive function and even the size of the human brain. This is now a notion which is quite popular among scientists and evolutionary biologists as well as technologists. Last week, some of you may have seen a really interesting article by a fellow named Stephen March, who was a poet, and Stephen actually makes a really good argument. His argument is, I figured out what AI is. It's the microwave. So why the microwave? So the microwave, which was invented about half a century ago, was, by the way, an accidental invention. It was not. It was discovered completely accidentally. It ended up heating things when things were placed close to the microwave. In general, the application as a secondary outcome. But his argument was that when the microwave was first introduced as a commercial product, a consumer product, it was introduced with the notion that it would fundamentally transform how humans cook. That we would no longer have kitchens. We would no longer have chefs. We would no longer have ovens. And of course, we all know the punchline to this, that on the one hand, microwaves have found a valuable place in the vast majority of home kitchens and even in professional kitchens and restaurants and so forth. But it hasn't completely transformed the way we think about cooking or processing food. It's an efficiency tool. In our household, it has an incredibly important role. It reheats leftover Chinese food. There's no more important role in our kitchen than that. But it certainly hasn't made us remove the gas stove from our apartment, because that is incredibly valuable in its own right. And hasn't really transformed the way we think about eating. So, I think about this a lot because I think we're still very deeply in a debate in the broader AI industry. For those of you who don't know me and my background, I've been in both the education. I started my career as a teacher at a school administrator, but I was an early EdTech advocate. I wired the first New York City K-12 school building here to the internet. I was one of the first teachers in New York City to actually have an email address back in 1990. So I've been an advocate of this technology for a very long time. But I've also been in the AI world. I started working in AI applications when I was in high school in 1985, and really gave up on it in the early 90s because we had really not made much progress. And it was only recently that I got pulled back into it. But this debate about microwave versus fire is very, very alive in AI research and AI development worlds right now. So you have people like Sam Altman. This was at ASU GSV a year ago this spring when a teacher asked him, is AI going to replace me? And his answer very famously was, no, AI will not replace you, but someone using AI might. Right? So interesting that those folks who are really leading the AI revolution are the ones who are leaning towards microwave when we talk to most of us, perhaps because they are trying to vary the lead a little bit, because that's not necessarily the way that the labor markets are experiencing this. So, I think the headline of the writer's strike a year ago in Hollywood and the most recent dock workers strike was, these are the first strikes that humans have mounted, first organized labor strikes mounted against machines. I mean, that is literally what they are saying they're doing. This is a battle against AI taking time. And again, I don't have the answer to this, whether we should be as worried as these folks are, or whether we should take Sam Altman's position on it. But I think it's something we need to think about. And I think the thing that makes me lean more towards fire versus microwave is we are still, I keep reminding myself, only 2 years into general availability of generative AI tools. Right? Even a year ago where we were was very, very different. If you think about ChatGPT, it's a toddler in the grand history of the evolution of AI. So what have some of the breakthroughs been for developments since we were talking about this last year? So to me, these are really the 6 crucial advances that we have seen in AI more broadly, not in EdTech alone, really in the AI sector as a whole. The first, which was just starting when we talked last year, is this embrace of true multimodality. We all have been sort of introduced to generative AI through the context of text. But actually, these large language models now are as fluent in image, in sound, in video as they are in text, in spoken word. Not only fluent in terms of from an input standpoint, but as you all have seen from all the recent demos, increasingly from an output standpoint too. They are able to generate high quality video with as much proficiency as they can write very high quality prose. Right? So that multimodality, I think, is critically important. At the end, I'm going to show you something that sort of speaks to the applications of education. The second area, which is a mouthful, these AI folks do not know how to come up with an average. I'll tell you that much. So retrieval augmented generation RAG. This is for those of us who are developers or in the AI development world, very, very, very important breakthrough, which is this notion that we can now create very specialized databases of knowledge that may go very deep into, I was having a conversation earlier today with someone from the Gates Foundation about really understanding the learning progressions necessary to understand something like basic algebra. Amazingly, LLMs, with their broad sort of general knowledge, don't understand the specific predecessor skills that are necessary in order for students to progress in their understanding of something like the quadratic formula. So these abilities to, and these can be about anything, it can be about auto assembly, it can be about how you send man the moon or limitism. These specific databases now are being combined with the general understanding to provide very specialized knowledge sort of together with generalized knowledge. This is a very challenging prospect because what we found was that when we started to go vertical and add that vertical knowledge to the general models are getting dumber. And so one of the big breakthroughs has been to figure out how to orchestrate that vertical and horizontal understanding in a way that doesn't prioritize or bias one versus the other. And then the orchestration, when you go to so a year ago today, if you type a 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication problem into ChatGPT, you only got it right less than 60% of the time. Because generative AI is not a calculation machine. It's a statistical predictor. So it will give you an answer that it thinks has a good probability of being right. That's not the way math works. That's not the way arithmetic works. Today, if you ask it that question, it goes to a tool actually, and that knows how Python and knows how to do math and calculations, and it will come back with the answer. The magic is in that orchestration layer that's saying, this is a math problem. I'm bad at those. Let's go refer that over to this tool or to this route. So that's a big breakthrough. And that's the tool integration part. So it's both data and knowledge databases, but also specific tools. The fourth area is memory and large context. This is something that people don't really, it's not really on people's consciousness, top of their consciousness, but incredibly important. So when you think about a ChatGPT session, it started with a session was a self-contained entity. You type a question, ask ChatGPT to write a limerick about your best friend Tom, and then you go away and you come back and start a new session and ask it to tell you about Shakespearean poetry. Today, the underlying foundation models know that you were asking for a limerick before, know that your friend is named Tom. They are gaining a cumulative understanding of you through your sessions that allows its answers to get more and more sophisticated. And that notion of memory is going to be vitally important in the education field as we move forward. I'll talk more about that. Chain of thought reasoning and agents. So you've probably heard a little bit about this, a lot of talk about this recently. So chain of thought, there's a little trick that we used to, a bunch of us, many of us, I shouldn't say myself, many people in the AI research community discovered, which was that if you asked ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok or any of these foundation models to take its time and think things through and give you the answer step by step to give you that answer. And so this has been systematized through the new models where if you use something like GPT-4o1, it will take a much longer time to give you the answer, but it will be much more thoughtful in its answer. And the logic and the argument for it is that these early models were optimized for speed because they wanted to keep the consumer engaged. It was kind of the social media model, right? Wanted to keep you clicking and reading and entering. But that's not what a molecular researcher wants. A molecular researcher wants an AI system to go out and really think things through before it comes back with an answer. And so we've now achieved that through what we call chain of thought reasoning. And some of Google it now, some of the results we're getting are really spectacular. So we are now in the realm where AIs are discovering things rather than simply processing our input and then giving us something that's a response to what we've asked. They're able to go out and really provide truly novel insights about the world. And that's really combined with this notion of agents. So increasingly that chat box or the voice interface for ChatGPT will talk to this, what I call the orchestration layer. The orchestration layer is now going to send AI agents out to do all sorts of different things in parallel. So when my team now codes in AI, this is how we code. We build agents that are really good at different things, good at modeling something in 3D, good at going and getting answers from the web about something, good at actually figuring out how to, build a presentation, a business presentation of all this. And so when I say something like, hey, I've got a new idea for an EdTech product that shows molecules spinning in space, 5 different agents are going out to do very specific parts of that and coming back orchestrating the answer using chain of thought and giving me a really sophisticated response. So this is just toddler stuff still, right? You gotta realize we are in the infancy of AI, but this is an enormous advance from where we were a year ago. So other ways to visualize this, and I showed this last year. This was the tipping point between GPT 3.5, which in Q1 of 23 was the state-of-the-art US model, and GPT-4, which came out in Q2, right? And so one of the things that AI researchers like to do, benchmark a lot of things to benchmark the intelligence of AI models. One way they like to do it, which I like because it's related to our domain of education, is they give it 20 of the hardest academic tests that we give all of our students. Right? The AP, the GRE, the SAT, the SAT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The blue is how GPT 3.5 performed in Q1 of last year. It was able to pass half of the 20 very difficult exams that we did humans. Right? Didn't know, it wasn't looking for the answer to these, I just want to be clear. We gave it new versions of these tests it was not able to train on, and it was able to pass half. Interestingly, where does it do very poorly? It does very poorly in things like AP calculus. It's not good at math. It's very good at AP environmental science. I will leave any commentary blank on that for now, but it's interesting which disciplines does well. Well, literally 6 weeks later when they came out with GPT-4, that's green. It was able to pass just about every single one of these tests. It's still not great at things like AP calculus. Well, this summer, GPT-4o comes out. Look at what we have. Right? At first, in June, it came out at 71% on AP calculus. They revised the model with GPT-4o1, 85%. By most researchers, and most of the AI researchers I speak with today, by which I mean like 95%, feel that by this time next year, state-of-the-art foundation of that model will be able to get 100% in any academic test that we do. And I think the reason I say this is, as an educator as well as a technology, this to me begs a very foundational question, which is, why the hell are we giving these tests? What are we measuring? What does it mean to be intelligent, to be knowledgeable, to be educated? Is the purpose of a human being to show how well we approximate the output of the machine? I personally, I hope that's not the answer, but it means we have to think very profoundly about what the purpose of education is, not just how to do what we do today more efficiently. And we see some clues of this, right? So this was a study that was done last summer that let ChatGPT, I think this was 3.5 at the time, compete against human students in 32 university courses in sort of traditional majors. And then they re-dimensionalized it, and the teachers didn't know, the instructors didn't know whether it was a human student or an AI that was submitting the homeworks and the exams. And then they refactored this sort of along cognitive domains and dimensions. And what you find is so fascinating is, so the blue is the human student's performance, the green is the AI's performance. Humans still outperform AI in every cognitive domain except for one, which was factual recall. When it comes to things like metacognition, procedural understanding, analysis, application of new learning and concepts, creativity, the humans still outperform. And I think in this is a really important clue, because this is being mirrored in what we see in the labor markets. So this was a survey that was done a year ago this past spring by the World Economic Forum. It was not necessarily related to AI, but they went and they asked hiring managers from global Fortune 1000 companies, what are the qualities that you're hiring for today? And you'll see reading, writing, arithmetic is 16th out of 26. What are the top 10? Analysis, creativity, agility, resilience, motivation, awareness, curiosity, technological literacy, attention to detail, empathy, leadership, social influence. These are all the things that you don't test for. Okay. So I think there's an argument to be made here, and yes, by the way, you see the QR code, that's the research behind these slides. To me, these argue in the direction of fire versus microwave. But again, I'm not sure yet. This is what I'm sharing with you my current thinking about this. But I think, to me, there's a clarion call to accelerate something that, as educators, we've been talking about for the better part of 7 years, which is we need to radically accelerate this shift from the 3 R's to what I call the 7 C's. That the new basic skills for human beings are looking at things like curiosity, conversation, collaboration, creativity, compassion, change tolerance, courage. Again, these are the things that are not built into our standards. They're not built into our tests. They're not built into our curriculums. They're not built into our teacher training programs. So when I come back to this about the 50% use of adoption of AI, Ethan Mollick, who's a great follow on Twitter and on Threads, and you'll follow him, he's a professor at Penn, who writes a lot about the educational implications of AI. What he said about this is a picture of a profound and lasting change. We haven't seen this rate of adoption ever before in technology in schools, but one that is happening quickly at the individual level, while the large systemic level has barely begun to emerge. And I heard that theme echoed in a lot of what was said before me today. So I go into schools around the country. They can't even use paid ChatGPT or even ChatGPT in an institutional way because the user agreements don't permit anyone under 13 to use it. So most of their students are not legally allowed to use it. And frankly, let's be honest, from OpenAI standpoint, schools in our market are tertiary on their list of priorities right now. You can't even get a call from OpenAI right now about getting an enterprise license for a school. Try it. You can't do it. And a challenge to some of the vendors here is there's huge opportunity to do value-added resell sale in this market. The basic access to generative AI capabilities at an enterprise level with SOC compliance, with privacy, with persistence, with integration into student and district and university identity management systems, all the interoperability stuff we talked about. That is going to be incredibly valuable to schools and universities. They just do not have a path towards this right now. So this was me earlier this year. I'm going to give you kind of 3 slices of time slices of this that sort of kind of chart the path from microwave to fire. Right? So this was me earlier this year at a high school in Oklahoma City, and the teacher was very brave. He invited me in to see something he's never done before. So he's teaching here Alexander the Great and Hellenistic culture in Greece. And instead of, normally he would build a slide deck on each of the aspects of Hellenistic culture, philosophy, education, warfare, blah, 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 blah. And he'd sit there, stand there, and he'd deliver the speech, and the kids would beautifully take that out. In this class, he said, we're going to do this differently. I'm going to give each of you one of the slides to build. and I'm going to give you ChatGPT, and you're going to build it with ChatGPT, and then you're going to present it back to the whole class. Great assignment. Love it. Well, what was fascinating was, half of them couldn't log into ChatGPT. They were having account issues, they were being blocked, their IP address was blocked. And the second thing was, they had, and probably more telling, they had no idea how to ask ChatGPT a question. So what they would do is they would say, here's their prompt. My slide is on, the role of philosophy in Hellenistic society. Hellenistic philosophy. That was the problem. They're treating it like search. And if you remember, for those of you who remember in schools back in 1997, 2000, when search first arrived in schools, we were in the same spot. We had no idea how to write a search query, right? We take it for granted today. This is not going to happen automatically. And this is a huge opportunity for us to really get into schools, to teach students, to teach the teacher. The teacher had no idea how to tell the students how to do query. He was doing the queries in weird ways, what prompts I can say. So this is, to me, microwave opportunity. I'm not dismissing microwave opportunity. I think there's huge value in microwave opportunity, but this is microwave opportunity. This is about operational efficiencies. This is about milking the most out of these available tools. It's about how we rethink and refactor pedagogy and curriculum but still trying to achieve the same outputs, just in different ways than they are. This was the spring. This is a group of middle schoolers in Dallas who heard me give a speech about the future of AI. Their teachers created a new class where they got to define the curriculum. And their only guidance was, go find a really gnarly problem to go solve with technology. And what they got very excited about was helping blind people to see paintings. So they had created sort of 3D, extruded, printed versions of artistic masterpieces that you can touch. But they said, we want these paintings to be able to talk to the blind person, to tell them the significance of what they're actually touching, even if it's not extruded. It's 3D printed, very costly, very time-consuming, not scalable. So they had I built a little demo for them where I used computer vision for ChatGPT, where I was able to monitor what I was touching on painting and then provide commentary. And literally 3 weeks later, they won first prize in the statewide innovation competition against high school students. And they are now filing for patent for this technology. So this is something more than microwave. This is a fundamental rethinking of what activities students are doing, what they're learning. I don't know how to assess this. I mean, you cannot give them a standardized test to assess the value add of what happened here. I don't know how to scale this, but there's something profound happening here that we need to figure out how to follow. And if I were back at Pearson, or with my Savas colleague over here from my table, this would cause me to have some profound sort of reflection about what it is we're actually shrink wrapping into textbooks and teaching. Okay, I want to end with this one. So this is I didn't have this here, but so in the last year, I've been working in stealth mode on a company of my own called Luyen. And we're really excited about some of the things that we're seeing. So let me tell you what you're looking at here. So what we've discovered is that in this multimodal LLM world, that we can train AI to observe what happens in both online, Zoom, and physical classroom settings like this, and report back with a level of fidelity that is as high, if not higher than human observer. Through transcription of the spoken word, recording and transcription of spoken word, but through also the prosody, so the tonality and inflection of the human voice. And then here, actually through image recognition. So in this Zoom, you can see, it's a little hard to see, but it knows from the little name tags here who everybody is. It's able to, and this is coming back to the issues of student information systems, identity management. I think we're going to see a complete paradigm shift in the whole notion of interoperability and student data, because we're operating still in a world of highly structured data where you need a database field for every attribute of a student. That's not the way generative AI works. It's able to infer all of this important information from multisensory exposure. So it says, hey, and by the way, none of this content is exposed to the user. This is going into the RAG as I mentioned before, that becomes what the user's querying. So when the user says, hey, what did the teacher do X? It's using this information to say, oh, I know who the teacher is, and I know what she was doing. So you can see this is a virtual classroom. It's in a good format. Emily Words appears to be leading the session. I think she's the one positioned at the top, wearing a white top and glasses. Chef Rachel, this is a culinary school, by the way, culinary school. Rachel Kazone is next to her, also engaged in discussion. It knows what kind of expressions they have, if they're engaged, if they're not engaged. The problem this online college was trying to unlock was they couldn't tell whether their students were engaged in the online learning classroom. And Duolingo was able to tell it across 1,000 sessions for them, right? Not just one or two. And then here's the transcription, so it's now diarizing each voice, so it doesn't identify the voice of the students. For privacy, it just gives a speaker number, but it's able to isolate every single voice in the Zoom. And then it provides a dashboard of engagement. Right? And that dashboard was built in like 30 minutes, because we don't build dashboards in code anymore. We built this through product. We told it what we wanted in plain English, sitting next to an educator, and it generates that. And then it can summarize exactly what happened. And again, this is all structured by our partner and me saying, all right, we want to know about structured enthusiasm, about student support, engagement, interactive elements. Change any one of those things, it can instantly rerun and gives you all that. So I want to come back to this question of fire versus fire, because I think maybe to not bury the lead anymore, I think it's both, but I think it's in the reverse order of the way microwaves and fire were sort of discovered by humans. I think it's microwave first, and fire quickly on the heels. So I think where we're going to see the adoption of AI in our educational marketplace first is around operational efficiency. It's around being able to do things cheaper, better, with more insight and more intelligence. But it will be within the context of the goals and the objectives that we have traditionally set for schools and for our students and for our teachers. But I think very quickly that's going to start to evolve because the rate of change is so quick. I mean, for any of you who are using these tools in your lives, it would be hard. You'd be hard pressed to say they haven't changed the way you do very fundamental things that you do. So on the microwave side, I would say, if I were any of you working on this, these are the things I'd be focused on: affordable, safe, enterprise-level access to data for educational institutions. It seems like a really boring problem. Whoever fixes that, there's a shit ton of money. Sorry, playing French, but there's a lot of money to be made in getting that right. It's a real problem right there. Teacher training. Teachers simply don't know how to use these tools, and they're scared of it, which is why they're not actually using them with students. And we're not careful. We're headed down the same path we're headed in social media, which is the students are going to take charge, but they won't have the guidance of the adults in the room to use it in productive ways. So I really don't want to make that mistake again, but this is a huge opportunity. AI curriculum and integration into traditional curriculum and into traditional curriculums. I'm on the board of Learning.com, which creates, is known for creating coding curriculums for schools around the country, around the world. And I've said to them, coding is no longer, and I apologize to coders, myself included, is no longer a future-proof job. It's a commoditized skill, right? The more interesting thing is how do we get them to use AI to solve problems through code? And the code is just the sort of the byproduct of that. And so building AI, that's just coding, but I mean, it applies to anything you would do. You want to get into, statistics or business or history or even English language, the use of AI is going to be critical to your success. And we're seeing that, interestingly, more and more at the collegiate level. So Harvard, the entry-level computer science course, legendary course, has been around for 35, 40 years, is CS50. CS50 hasn't been changed really fundamentally in 4 years. It was changed last summer to be rewritten from the ground up using generative AI. Harvard Business School has now, you may have seen an article, they actually saying they are now consider themselves to be an AI native program. They have redesigned their entire curriculum around the use of generative AI. K-12 is lagging very far typical in educational adoption. But the universities will be the tail that wags the dog because these schools are not going to be able to get their kids prepared for colleges as these colleges accelerate change in the program. So this is a huge, big booming area for exploration and efficiency tools. So, when I hear about interoperability, I actually ask myself a different question about it, which is how is generative AI and how are large language models going to change the nature of interoperability? Because things like identity are going to mean something very different. We will be able to infer identity in the way that Amazon can infer identity, Meta can infer identity. It doesn't have to be a set of discrete fields in a traditional database anymore. It's going to be very different. The validation is still going to be incredibly important. But how do we validate that? We get a bunch of humans around and say, oh, we got two records that seem to contradict, in our table, in our assist or our LTI table here. And then, we apply human logic to this. Well, AI will be able to actually apply that logic at scale much more effectively than a bunch of tired computers. So how does AI allow us to achieve the goals of interoperability in a different way? That's the way I would look at that question. But on the fire side, I would say, we've been talking about this personalized learning at scale forever and ever. It's almost embarrassing to talk about it now for those of us who have invested many millions of dollars in many efforts over the years. But we're seeing something very different happen now, right? So if you go back to that classroom observation system that I developed, to put it together with other concepts, we're now adding memory to it. So now, not only does it know, oh, that is Luyen in that box there, or this classroom activity, it knows for the next 50 videos, that's Luyen. And by knowing that, it says, Luyen has always asked a question. Every single class. Why didn't he ask a question today? So we now have an orthogonal layer of data that we didn't have. I love your notion about the exception reporting from ticketing. This is kind of like the automated version of this in a way, right? It's generating all that, but it's not generating just the tickets or the exceptions. It's providing insights about that and saying, hey, this is why I think this is actually happening. And we actually use this in other settings where the AI is starting to even make predictions that I would consider to be along the lines of what you might, in a primitive sort of way, start to call clinical observations. We didn't ask it for it, but it started to be something. Student assessment. There is no question in my mind that what I showed you is the future of student assessment. It will be a personalized understanding of the student's journey rather than an number two pencil and the bubble that we have been using for longer than years. Remember, testing as the way that we assess will disappear. Assessment will become insights from the exhaust of the actual learning experience. I have no doubt about that. And that's going to be transformative, not just for learners, but for the industry. Think about the $20 billion industry that's student assessment right now. AI teacher and program evaluation, really understanding what teachers are doing, how effective they are, how effective a program, a school, an institution, a district, a college, a university is by aggregating student learning through these sorts of observations. New pedagogical models, how do we teach? I mean, maybe our teachers should not be the source of knowledge and skills. Maybe they should be the mentors and sources of social emotional learning. And the knowledge and skills comes from AI. I don't know the answer, but we're at a point where we have to ask those questions. And that's going to lead to fundamentally new standards and new curriculums as well. Now, states and large educational institutions are very slow to change. But as we start to see the labor sector under serious duress from this confrontation with what the emerging set of machine capabilities are, it's going to drive change here faster than I think we've ever seen before. So again, I think it's both microwave and fire. I think they're really meaty problems to be solved in both domains. But I think if we don't pay attention to fire, we risk being overtaken by machines. So with that, I'm going to end and take any questions you have. Or comments.
At the other conference yesterday, one of my favorite quotes was, "Innovation happens at the rate of trust." And how do you see that playing out? Because some of the things that are possible with AI are one of the reasons why people are pushing back so much against it, is that fear factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a healthy fear and skepticism and worry about the negative potentialities of this new technology. I mean, we're in an election cycle now where you're already seeing a massive amount of fake news and increasing difficulty that consumers have of that information to discern what's real and what's not real. There's one of many different examples. I think my answer to that is generally, you don't solve the problem by avoiding the problem. The genie is out of the problem. We're not going to, when I first introduced, in 1990, I gave a presentation to CEO of a huge publishing company. The main name was of a simulated archaeological excavation we had created to replace a textbook-bound curriculum around ancient culture and civilizations. 1990. And spent a day with them and showed them all the stuff. They owned the textbook, the textbooks in K-12. And the president at the end of it said, I get it. How do I kill it? And I'm having that exact same conversation today when I go around to schools and universities. And my answer to that is, you can't kill it. If anything, you should understand that now. You can't even slow it down. This is happening much faster than the internet now. So the question is, how do you get smart about it fast so you help shape the course of all this? And truthfully, because we're in the infancy, it's the students, it's our kids, the next generation, who are going to really make the most important decisions about this. And if we're not arming them now to make those decisions in an ethical and informed way, we're going to be in much deeper trouble than if we sort of avoid the issue. So I know that's the hard answer, but that is the answer that I give, is trust. And there's another quote about trust, right? Trust is manufactured, it's not given. And I think we have to manufacture that trust into the future roadmaps of AI. But we're at a crucible moment in terms of that. And if you look at the leadership of AI, you have to ask yourself as a society, are these the people that we want to lead this mission forward? Do we have the people at the helm who are going to lead this in the right direction?
So we look at the data where you showcase that within a year how ChatGPT or similar tools covered those topics that on various exams that we were not able to cover, right? And then still we looked at areas, for example, statistical and involved, they are surpassing human, but there are other 5 parameters where they are not surpassing yet. But the level of advancement in that area might seem surpass these areas as well. Right. The singularity aspect that is being discussed. Right?
So,
and the question again comes back, as an education and educator, if all those things are being done by ChatGPT or similar tools, what's the purpose of education and what is to be covered over there?
So I think, it's a great question, right? So I don't know if you've ever heard, but it's like, okay, you're showing me that humans are still better at everything but factual recall, but given the pace of improvement, right, human evolution, arguably, if you don't subscribe to the fire argument, and without AI, physical human evolution has plateaued. And AI is taking off at the speed of response. So it's a great question. I think that the great blind spot for AI is currently conceived, and almost definitionally, is judgment. Not reason, but judgment. Because I'll give you a very concrete example. So a few years ago, MIT created you can still find it's called a moral machine. They created a game you could play on their website where it's the famous trolley car problem. Your cars come down, and it has to either hit a old man or a young baby. What would you vote for? And I used to teach philosophy. I used to do this with my students all the time. I said, why is MIT doing this? Well, it wasn't just MIT. It was MIT's autonomous driving that had created this. Why? They were trying to crowdsource the ethics for full self-driving cars. And I guarantee to you today that many more than 100 full self-driving cars have had to make that crucible decision already. Who programmed that ethic into it? If you ask the AIs, what is the right answer? They can tell you what the right answer is if you take a utilitarian approach or an Aristotelian approach, or they can't make a human judgment for us almost by definition, right? So that's why they were crowdsourcing it, because they want. So to me, judgment, ethics, the decisions about what we want the human race to be are things that the machines can support our answers, but we have to make that fundamental decision. And I think in education, we have avoided putting judgment, ethics at the core. It used to be the core of their education, it no longer is. So to me, I think we need to shift towards these questions, these fundamental and enduring questions of what is the right thing to do? Why do we do what we do as human beings? Because that's what will continue to differentiate us versus the machines. The machines can optimize against the framework we give it, but they won't give us the framework that we think is right for us.
Just a continual thought, is we can still be an arbitral statement, because even after all those ethics and all, not all individuals can take the same decision based on ethics and human. And so will we.
Yeah, no, and listen, philosophy is unlike computer science in that it's a non-deterministic discipline. There is no right answer to anything. We can get very philosophical about this. I feel it's the pursuit of that truth that's what makes us human. It's not arriving at the truth. It's that conversation that we have about what the right thing is that makes us human. And I think that's the conversation we need to preserve, supported by AI. But there are more pedestrian examples, right? Could you build an AI picture on the internet screen? Could you build a picture that never caved to pressure, that always threw the perfect picture? Of course you could. Would we watch that game? No. So there's things that you're beginning. I think the beauty of AI is that it is forcing us to confront what it is to be human in a very profound and focused way. And I don't have the answer to that yet. I don't think anybody does, but I think that is the new project for all of us. What is that space for what we do that machines can't do?
How soon do you think this changing curriculum and standards will evolve? Because if that doesn't evolve, a generation will be left behind.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think you're already seeing it change disproportionately across the landscape. So I think part of what's going to happen is, as I said, the labor market is going to dictate the change, right? When our students can't get jobs, our university students can't get jobs. So my last company, 2 companies ago, was a company called Trilogy, and it was a tech boot camp that we ran private label for universities. We went from $0 to $100 million in 1 year, and we sold it for $800 million in 7 years. I don't think I could raise $1 million for that, because we were teaching coding, we were teaching data analytics, skills that frankly are now commodity. So I think the labor markets are going to be a key force. There's another interesting thing. I spent a fair amount of time talking about these topics in Southeast Asia and China last fall, just about a year ago. We better not get complacent in places like the United States about this change, because the educators I talked to in China are way ahead of us in terms of understanding the importance of the shift, because they understand that their focus here is what has held them back in the global industrial stage. It's why they're not the ones building the best chips in the world. The Taiwanese are. And so we're seeing a leapfrogging effect. I think we're at real risk in parts of the world that we may be taking for granted, that they are going to actually lean into this transformation faster than we are. So I think global competitiveness, and I think the labor markets are going to dictate change as they will do in the education. But sadly, that won't be equally distributed, right? So the worst schools with the fewest resources will likely be the ones that change the slowest. So when we talked about, I remember when I put the internet into the school back in 1990, we talked about the digital divide, right? That was a private school and public schools, which took 10 years to follow. This is going to be a much worse digital divide if we don't get on it as an industry.
In fact, you should have the divide, but mobile communication came in, but countries like India and all, they took a speed forward because they had nothing there, and we got stuck because we had infrastructure that hadn't changed. And if we get left behind this way, it will be very, very costly.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think there's always there's a tax you pay for being an incumbent. Right? It's legacy. And to be able to start de novo with a Starlink and a smartphone is a great thing. So I agree. Anything else? I think we're out of time. Thank you all very much.